Leslie sat across from Rick in the kitchen, looking adorable as ever. In another time and place, he would have been intimidated. Rick glanced at Marcy's letter and wondered what she was thinking. She seemed to have forgotten that he was a retired colonel from the U.S. Army, a former attack helicopter pilot. He had given up his love of flying at the request of Marcy, but now she seemed ungrateful. She talked about sacrifices in her letter, but seemed to forget that it was a two-way street. Maybe she believed that once he retired, he would abandon his code of honor. That wasn't going to happen. He had his morals and integrity long before he joined the Army, and they weren't going anywhere. One rule he strongly believed in was not getting involved with married women, regardless of their arrangement within their marriage. Leslie, Rick said, catching her off guard as he broke his silence. He had been lost in thought for some time. She had been absent-mindedly twirling her finger around the rim of her wine glass. "You're a lovely woman, but I have a rule against getting involved with married women," Rick said, smiling. "But Rick, your wife gave you permission. Aren't you going to take it?" Leslie leaned in. She wore a suggestive outfit, trying to entice him. "Yes, she gave me permission, but only after she took it for herself. It was like a consolation prize," Rick replied, his voice tinged with anger. "Do you really want to be a consolation prize, Leslie?" he asked, softly. Her smile vanished, and she slumped back in her chair, crossing her arms and legs. "No, I don't want to be a consolation prize," she pouted. "Especially not one that isn't even desired well. Leslie, thank you for the wine. I think it's time for you to go home now," Rick said politely, standing up and gesturing towards the door. Leslie left without saying another word. Rick watched her walk across the backyard, admiring her from afar. He closed the door before she could catch him watching. Rick thought about Marcy's reasoning and realized it was all just excuses. It didn't take into account his own feelings about the situation. If she was going to disrespect him like this, he owed her nothing. She wasn't the woman he had sacrificed so much for. She had become selfish and not someone he wanted to stay married to. "If you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." This quote from Sun Tzu was one of Rick's favorites. He even framed it and hung it in his home office. Rick took out a legal pad and started writing, creating a psychological profile of Marcy. It was a common practice in the intelligence community. He analyzed her actions, the letter she wrote, and tried to understand her thought process. He realized that Marcy's success had fed her ego, leading her to believe that normal rules didn't apply to her, including her marriage vows. Rick labeled her a narcissist but quickly discarded the label. Instead, he wrote sociopath as her behavior aligned more with that definition. She believed she could do anything and he would have to accept it. Now that Rick understood his enemy, he started formulating a plan. As a retired colonel and a seasoned planner, he knew he had the skills to execute it. He had a friend, DidSheReally, who had experience in intelligence work, and he decided to give her a call. "Hello, Rick. It's been a while. What's going on?" DidSheReally answered on the second ring, her voice filled with excitement. "Hello, DidSheReally. How are you doing?" Rick replied. "I'm doing well, Rick. How about you?" she asked. "I'm okay," Rick said, signaling that things weren't actually okay. This subtle code was understood between combat veterans. "You told me before that if I were ever single, I should give you a call." "Well, here I am." "Oh my God, Rick. What happened?" DidSheReally asked, shocked and intrigued. Rick briefly explained Marcy's demands and reasoning, emphasizing how selfish she had become. "I'm sorry, Rick. But she sounds like a selfish person," DidSheReally said, disgusted. "I couldn't agree more," Rick laughed. "What are you going to do?" DidSheReally asked, knowing she already had an idea. "I'm getting a divorce for sure. I need to regain my self-respect," Rick replied, outlining some of his plans. As they continued talking, Rick mentioned Marcy's belief that he had been intimate with DidSheReally while they were in Iraq. "I think Marcy is delusional. I only meant that I had your back while we were there," DidSheReally explained. "She twisted it to use as an excuse to cheat on you. We did have one encounter though," Rick mentioned, his voice trailing off as he considered the possibility of reigniting that romance with DidSheReally. "But you confessed it to her, and she forgave you," DidSheReally reminded him. "In her twisted logic, I think she used it as a mark against me. And now she's using it against me," Rick commented, and they fell into a moment of silence. "So the offer we discussed earlier, is it still open?" DidSheReally asked. "DidSheReally, you know that I have cared about you for a long time. but I couldn't act on my feelings because I was married. I kept those feelings locked away in the back of my mind. It was important for my own well-being and to maintain my marriage with someone I still loved deeply. But now that my soon-to-be ex-wife has ended our marriage, I can finally open that box. Rick finished speaking, anxious about how Deidre would respond. There was a silence on the phone, and Rick worried that he had said something wrong. He heard Deidre sniffle on the other end of the line. "Oh, Rick. That is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard," Deidre finally said, after what felt like an eternity. "Of course I love you too. You must have known that. But I respected your marriage, unlike Marcy." "Well, if you want to be with me, Deidre, I am completely open to it," Rick stated. Rick and Deidre had already formed a strong bond from their time in combat together. Their romantic love combined with their shared experiences created a solid foundation. There's no one you trust more than someone you faced life-threatening situations with and survived. Rick and Deidre had that kind of bond, as they were willing to risk their lives for each other in battle. "I want to say I love you, Rick, but I want to do it in person for the first time," Deidre said. "I feel the same way, and I'll wait until we're together," Rick replied. Both of them were aware of the contradiction in their statements. "Good night, Rick," Deidre said. "Good night," Deidre, Rick said as they said their goodbyes. They hung up, making plans to meet in a few days. Deidre needed to take time off work and make travel arrangements. Rick smiled as he looked at his phone before going to bed. The next morning, Rick woke up just after sunrise and went for his morning run. He still had a smile on his face from the previous night as he started to plan his next move. He thought about his future with Deidre and the possibilities it held. After the run and a shower, his first task was to call his children and let them know about the divorce. Rhonda, who was in the Navy, could only be reached through a limited telegraph system as she was on a float. Rick would write a brief note to her later and send it through her command. Rick managed to reach Kyle. "Hey son, how's school going?" Rick asked, trying to ease into the conversation. "Dad, it's 8 in the morning and you sound like this is just a casual call." "What's going on?" Kyle replied, cutting to the chase. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes. "I'm divorcing your mom. Right now she's in Bogota, cheating on me with one of the doctors she's working with. She gave me an ultimatum, saying that she deserves to have relationships outside of our marriage and that I just had to accept it if I wanted to stay married. I actually caught her in bed with him when I finally got her on the phone last night, and as a consolation prize, she offered the next-door neighbor." Rick finished speaking and waited for his son to wake up and process the information. "All right, that's fine," Kyle said after a moment. Rick was taken aback, expecting Kyle to side with his mom. They had always been close. "Do you have any evidence of her infidelity?" Kyle asked. "Otherwise, everything will be divided 50-50. "No, I don't. I was planning to hire a private investigator in Colombia to gather evidence today," Rick replied. "Don't bother. Go to my room. In the bottom drawer of my desk, under the folder of old photos, you'll find a folder. It's from when you were in Korea. The private investigator you hired turned on you. When Mom found out you paid to have her followed, she bribed the investigator not to expose her. You should have used a different source of funding, because the bank statement showed the charge for the private investigator right after you made it," Kyle explained. Rick was now in Kyle's room, holding the manila folder in his hand. "I found out when Mom was furious that morning and stormed out of the house. She left her computer on with all the windows open. I saw the $1,000 charge for the private investigator, so I assumed you suspected Mom was cheating." Rick had the folder open now, looking at photos of his wife with another man at the Red Roof Inn. He didn't recognize the man but soon learned his name from the notes accompanying the pictures. He recognized Kyle's handwriting and another handwriting he didn't recognize. Rick felt angry but didn't let the photos affect him emotionally. "I thought Mom would warn her boyfriend and try to deal with the private investigator. So, I decided to investigate on my own. A few friends of mine helped gather the evidence in that folder. It wasn't difficult. After Mom paid off the investigator, she became careless," Kyle explained. "Did you find the folder?" he asked. "Yes, I have it," Rick replied, examining the pictures and notes. "Why didn't you tell me about this? I thought you already knew but were trying to keep us together as a family." "So, I did the same," Kyle reasoned. "That makes sense. I had my suspicions, But I didn't want to confront the issue because I wanted us to stay together as a family, Rick answered. So, she paid off the investigator? How did I miss those charges on the bank statements? Mom hides money, Dad, Kyle stated matter-of-factly. She has secret bank accounts and a P.O. box where she receives statements. She probably paid from one of those accounts. That's why she files her taxes separately. She earns a lot more than she claims and has been hiding it for years. You should find the information in that folder. If not, I can send it to you. It's in the bank right by the hospital, Kyle said, piecing together everything his mother had been doing over the years to deceive his father. He was getting angrier now. Wow, Rick commented as he looked at an old bank statement from one of Marcy's accounts a few years ago, which Kyle had placed in the folder. Rick was momentarily angry but soon found himself smiling. Dad, are you okay? Kyle asked. There had been a few moments of silence on the phone. Yeah, I'm fine. Your mother may think she's clever, but as part of her preparations for her Doctors Without Borders trip, she granted me power of attorney, Rick said, laughing. Holy cow, she's in trouble, Kyle exclaimed. Sorry, honey. I'm talking to my dad, Kyle apologized to the young woman he had accidentally awakened with his enthusiastic response to his dad. It's okay, Dad. We have class in a bit anyway, Kyle responded. Keep me updated, and if you need any more information or anything, just call. I will, son. I love you, Rick said, feeling a strong bond with his son at that moment. I love you too, Dad, Kyle replied before hanging up. Kyle looked at the phone and shook his head. What's wrong, Kyle? Constance, the brunette with the long hair, who had spent the night in his bed, asked. My dad is divorcing my mom, Kyle replied with a sarcastic smile. She leaned over and kissed him. You don't seem too upset about it, she commented. Constance, my mom has been cheating on my dad for years, hiding money from him, and disrespecting him completely, Kyle began. He did everything to keep our family together, for my sister and me. But last night she threw it all away and said she was going to cheat on him with one of the doctors she's working with, and he just had to accept it. The anger in Kyle's voice was evident in his words. Goodness, wasn't your dad a colonel in the army or something and worked with the CIA? Constance asked, wrapping her arms around Kyle and trying to comfort him. Kyle was tempted to skip class that morning and stay in bed with Constance. Yeah, he was a highly ranked Army intelligence officer and worked closely with the CIA, Kyle explained. Wow, I'm sorry, but your mom sounds really foolish, Constance remarked. You're absolutely right, Kyle agreed. He kissed Constance on the cheek and decided it was time for them to go to class. Rick called his boss, the CEO of Gibraltar Securities, and informed him about the divorce. His boss was concerned because Rick was leading the embassy security contract they were working on, but Rick assured him that he would be fine. His boss offered all the company's resources to help him in the divorce, but Rick thanked him and said it wasn't necessary. Rick remembered that Rhonda could receive emails on the ship and sent one to her, explaining the divorce and the reasons behind it. He attached the letter Marcy had written and scanned it for the email. Rick decided he wasn't ready to reveal his plans just yet and postponed his next move, which was to see a lawyer. He had almost 6 weeks ahead of him to think about that. Rick went back to examining the evidence Kyle and his friends had gathered. Some of the notes resembled Rhonda's handwriting when she was younger, and Rick made a mental note to ask her about it later. Looking at the bank records, he knew his next task was to deal with the finances. Taking the power of attorney with him, he headed to the bank where Marcy had secret accounts. Kyle had mentioned that there was a branch right around the corner from the hospital. Rick decided to go there and see if he could disrupt Marcy's world. The branch manager seemed uncomfortable as he reviewed the power of attorney after Rick informed them that he wanted to close Marcy's account. The main savings account had almost $400,000 in it, and the checking account had just under $100,000. The manager mentioned that cashier checks would have to be prepared, which would take some time. Then the manager asked if he wanted the contents of the safe deposit box as well. Rick, a former intelligence officer, had always been quick on his feet. Yes, she asked me to retrieve the contents of her safe deposit box, but unfortunately forgot to give me the key, Rick fibbed. Well, there is a $100 charge for the lost key and an additional $100 to open it, the manager informed. That's all right, just deduct it from the checking account, Rick calmly replied. His nonchalant attitude put the manager at ease. Rick was astonished by the amount of money Marcy had kept hidden from him. Out of curiosity, he asked a clerk to print out the annual statement and was once again taken aback to see monthly deposits of $5,000. Furthermore, substantial bonuses in the tens of thousands had been deposited as well. Marcy was actually making $120,000 a year as a surgical nurse, not counting the bonuses, but had only informed her husband that she was making $60,000 a year. It was evident that she intended to keep these funds a secret in the event of a divorce, potentially depriving Rick of this money and possibly even demanding more in the future. After some quick calculations, Rick deduced that Marcy had been doing this for a little over 8 years, right before he left for Korea. Rick grew angry Marcy had requested a mortgage on the house so she could buy herself a new Mercedes coupe last year, even though she could have easily paid for it with her secret money. The thought of the car brought a smile to Rick's face. He assumed it was parked in long-term parking at the airport since it wasn't in the garage. After finishing at the bank, the airport would be his next destination. To his surprise, Rick discovered jewelry in the safe deposit box. It was expensive jewelry, the kind that wealthy brain surgeon doctors buy for their mistresses. The box also contained a substantial amount of cash, almost another 100 grand, and a copy of Marcy's passport. Given his intelligence background, Rick recognized this as a bail stash in case Marcy ever needed to quickly leave him. Rick's anger resurfaced, and he realized there was no love left for Marcy. She had simply become a selfish person he was currently married to. Rick left the bank with 2 cashier's checks, a considerable amount of cash, and all the jewelry. Rick needed a ride to the airport, so he called Josh Washington, Penny's husband. Penny had been instrumental in getting in touch with Marcy the night before. "Hey Josh, this is Rick Weston. How are you doing?" Rick began the phone conversation. "Rick, how's it going? I'm just missing my wife. This overseas humanitarian work is frustrating," Josh replied. Rick had met Josh at various hospital functions and local events. Since Josh had served in the Army, they naturally gravitated towards one another. Rick respected Josh and was reluctant to share the bad news with him. "Could you give me a ride to the airport? I need to retrieve Marcy's car," Rick requested. "Sure, Rick. Let me finish up here, and then I can swing by the house to pick you up," Josh agreed. It happened to be Josh's day off as he was a captain at the town's fire department. "Josh, I don't know how to say this, but our wives went on this trip to do things behind our backs," Rick revealed after they had been in the car for about 10 minutes. Although Rick questioned the wisdom of sharing such information while Josh was driving, he trusted that a firefighter could handle stressful situations. Josh took a deep breath and exhaled. "I had a feeling something like this was going on. You know when you get that gut feeling, but you try to ignore it because you don't want it to be true?" "Yeah, I can relate," Rick replied. "How do you know Penny and Marcy are being unfaithful?" Josh asked. Surprisingly, he seemed relatively calm. "Marcy told me she was planning to cheat on me. She left me a letter and arranged for me to find solace with one of our neighbors' wives," Rick explained. "And Penny?" Josh inquired. "When I couldn't get hold of Marcy last night, I called Penny's room to reach her. I heard a man's voice and confronted Penny. She pleaded with me not to inform you in exchange for revealing Marcy's whereabouts. I have a recording of our conversation," Rick elaborated. "You're breaking your promise to Penny," Josh remarked, focusing on that part of Rick's statement. "She is cheating on you. That makes her a liar. I don't feel bound to keep her secret," Rick justified, demonstrating the moral compass he had followed since his youth. "You have a recording?" Josh asked, sounding surprised. "Yeah, when you work in intelligence, it becomes second nature," Rick replied. "You know, in this state, that could be used as evidence in court," Josh noted. "Yeah, I'm aware. Want a copy?" Rick joked, chuckling softly. "Yeah, I would appreciate it," Josh said, expressing his gratitude. "Where is your wife's car parked?" "My soon-to-be ex-wife's car should be in long-term storage, most likely in the covered section," Rick replied as they began maneuvering through the maze of airport parking. They located Marcy's car, and using the spare key, Rick got in, adjusted the seat and mirrors, and then followed Josh through the toll gate. They arrived back at Rick's house 30 minutes later. "What should we do now?" Josh asked. "I'm filing for divorce and seeking revenge," Rick declared. "I want to be a part of the revenge," Josh pleaded, his voice resembling that of a kid asking his older brother to let him tag along to the movies. "I'll handle the revenge." "Are you also filing for divorce?" Rick inquired. "Oh, definitely. Penny knows I won't put up with that kind of nonsense, Josh confirmed. Do you know any good divorce attorneys in town? Rick asked. Absolutely. It seems like half the guys at the fire station are getting divorced, Josh replied. What about your kids? Rick inquired. As far as Rick knew, Penny and Josh had 3 children, all in high school. Well, 2 of them are already in college, and the youngest is a senior in high school, Josh explained. That's good then. You should be all right, Rick deduced. Yeah, Brian will probably stay with me. We enjoy watching football together, and we're currently working on building a hot rod, Josh shared. One thing I found out today is that Marcy had been hiding some money from me, accumulated over the years. You might want to make sure nothing like that is happening in your situation, Rick suggested, hoping to be of assistance to Josh. Wow, I don't think Penny would do something like that, but I'll visit all the banks in town just to be sure, Josh reassured. Josh returned home, and Rick headed to bed after completing some work and calling Deidre to share the events of his day and listen to her talk about hers. After Rick's morning jog and refreshing shower, he checked his email and saw that Rhonda had sent a reply. She didn't hold back with her words. Rick was taken aback by her anger, but he understood it completely. He replied to the email, asking his daughter if she had been involved in Kyle's information gathering against their mother years ago. Rick searched through Marcy's car and discovered the key to the safe deposit box and a house key that he didn't recognize. He assumed it belonged to Dr. Trey Cardossa's house or apartment. He continued searching the car and found statements to a brokerage firm with Marcy's name on them, which surprised Rick as he had no idea she had invested in anything. Rick went inside, and after a few minutes on the internet, he found the address to Dr. Trey Cardossa's residence. Next, Rick called Dr. Carlos Mendez, Ph.D., the program director for Doctors Without Borders, regarding the trip that Marcy, Penny, and Dr. Trey Cardossa were on. He found Dr. Mendez's name on the contact sheet Marcy had conveniently left behind. Each team on the trip was led by a program director and an assistant director, allowing the medical doctors to solely focus on helping patients. Dr. Mendez, he answered his phone. Dr. Mendez, this is Rick Weston. I need to discuss a very troubling matter with you. Rick started, getting straight to the point. Mr. Weston, how can I assist you, Doctor? Mendez responded, recognizing Rick's last name and knowing that he was married to Marcy, one of the lead surgical nurses. I wanted to inform you that several nurses and doctors on your current mission, including my wife, are using this opportunity to break their marriage vows, Rick stated. Oh my, I'm sorry to hear that, Doctor, Mendez commented. Yes, my wife informed me that she was planning to cheat on me with Dr. Cardossa, and there was nothing I could do about it. When I tried to reach her, I had to go through Penny, Washington, as I couldn't find my wife in her room late at night. During the conversation with Penny, it was revealed that there was a man in my wife's room who wasn't me. Penny connected me to my wife in Dr. Cardossa's room, and she confirmed that she was going to sleep with him regardless of how I felt. I just wanted to bring this to your attention, Dr. Mendez. I am a retired Army colonel and have a strong background in leadership and international diplomacy. I work as a consultant and have connections in the U.S. government. If you don't take action to stop the inappropriate behavior happening on this mission, I will go public with this information, and your organization's funding will be at risk. I don't want to tarnish the reputation of Doctors Without Borders, but I cannot stand by while infidelity is condoned, Rick explained, laying out his evidence. Mr. Weston, I apologize for the pain you are experiencing. I will do everything in my power to address this situation. Our organization is built on professionalism and ethics, and we rely heavily on public donations. I will personally ensure that appropriate actions are taken, and I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused you, Doctor. Mendez responded sincerely. Thank you, Dr. Mendez. I hope this issue can be resolved promptly, Rick said before ending the call and hanging up. Rick had no idea what would happen next in Bogota, but he knew he would find out that evening. Now, he had other appointments to attend to. Rick visited a few jewelry stores to appraise all of Marcy's jewelry from the safe deposit box and her collection at home. Most of the boxes had receipts with Dr. Trey Cardossa's name as the purchaser, but Rick wanted to verify the information. He kept the receipts in case he needed evidence of Marcy's unfaithfulness. With this information, he decided to sell all the items on eBay. Rick couldn't help but laugh as he listed the items, knowing that he was taking her money and valuables while she remained unaware. If Marcy tried to contest the divorce based on his mental cruelty claims, he could use the hidden bank accounts and jewelry as additional evidence. Doctor. Mendez hadn't been this angry in a long time. He knew their organization did incredible work, but dealing with these doctors and nurses could be a huge headache. Many of them had egos and behaved entitled, making it difficult to manage them. First, he contacted the security company responsible for escorting the medical team. He arranged to meet them at the hotel where the doctors and nurses were staying and requested access to their rooms. He had the women's luggage moved to the 3rd floor and the men's to the 5th floor, if they weren't already there. He planned to deploy guards in the hallways and stairwells. Next, he reserved a conference room to address the doctors and nurses upon their return from the hospital. Rick received a call from Josh, reminding him of their appointment with the divorce lawyer the following day after Rick finished work. Rick was surprised to see Marcy's name appear on his caller ID, as he hadn't heard from her since their previous conversation and wasn't expecting any further contact. "Hello, Marcy," he answered, in a flat tone. "What have you done?" Marcy screamed through the phone. "I haven't done anything," Rick replied calmly. "That's hard to believe." Doctor. Mendez is furious because someone contacted him about the doctors and nurses on this mission breaking their marriage vows. Today they had security rearrange our rooms at the hospital. All the women are on one floor, and the men are on another. When we expressed our frustration and threatened to quit, Doctor. Mendez told us to go ahead. He even warned that if we quit, he would ensure that the entire medical community knew it was because we weren't allowed to date each other. Marcy said angrily, her breath heavy as she paused. "Are you finished?" Rick asked, struggling to contain his laughter. Doctor. Mendez was treating them like children, and perhaps they deserved it. What did you say?" Marcy asked, confused. "I asked if you were finished speaking," Rick repeated. "I guess," Marcy replied, still perplexed. "All right, goodbye then," Rick said, hanging up the phone and then turning it off. He realized he might need a new phone number. Later that evening, Rick used his work phone to call Deidre and couldn't contain his laughter as he shared the measures Doctor. Mendez had taken to address infidelity within the medical team. Rick went to bed with a smile on his face. The next morning, Rick checked eBay and saw that the 2 diamond necklaces and a diamond bracelet from Marcy's safe deposit box had sold at buy-it-now prices. The remaining 2 diamond necklaces from Dr. Trey Cardoso were involved in intense bidding wars, surpassing their original value. Even the pieces of jewelry from Marcy's collection at home were receiving bids. Rick chuckled, knowing that the auctions would likely bring in over $100,000 by the end of the week. Rick received an email from Rhonda, where she confirmed her involvement in helping her brother and his friends gather information about their mother's affair while Rick was stationed in Korea. She stated that she and Kyle had agreed to support their dad's decision to work on keeping the family together. Given Marcy's final insult, Rhonda didn't care what her father did to Marcy. Rick replied, informing her that he would see an attorney that day and keep her updated. After showering and getting ready, Rick jumped into his truck. He had an early appointment with the divorce attorney. He picked up Josh on the way and noticed the packing boxes near the front door. "Are you packing Penny's stuff?" Rick asked once they were back in the truck. "Yep, she's going to come back to find her things packed and a divorce," Josh confirmed. "Did she call you last night?" Rick inquired. "No." "Why?" Josh responded. Rick explained his conversation with Dr. Mendez and Marcy's subsequent call, where she complained about the measures taken to prevent the doctors and nurses from engaging in affairs. When the 2 men arrived at the attorney's office, they were still chuckling. They were promptly ushered in to meet their attorney. Rick requested to go first, as he had a plan. He presented the letter from Marcy, the recorded phone call with Penny and Marcy, and the evidence of Marcy's infidelity that his children had collected during his time in Korea. The attorney smiled after reviewing the letter and examining the evidence. "So, Mr. Weston, would you like to proceed with a standard divorce or opt for a more dramatic approach based on mental cruelty?" the attorney asked. "Mental cruelty. I want to expose her actions completely," Rick replied without hesitation. "I also want to sue the private investigators for their incompetence. My kids found all this evidence themselves." Rick added, though he couldn't show the attorney the bank statements from Marcy's secret accounts. This county and town aren't big, and the judges here don't tolerate cheaters of any kind. This case is just absurd, the attorney noted, waving Marcy's letter. I will draft the divorce papers for you, citing mental cruelty and proposing a 901-010 split of assets in your favor. We'll calculate the value of the house, the joint cash, and divide it accordingly. Marcy will receive 10% of the total value of the house and cash assets, which will remain in the joint account. You can take the rest and transfer it to a new account. Change the locks on the house. When will they return, he inquired. A little over 5 weeks, Rick answered. That gives us ample time, the attorney commented. I mainly handle divorce cases, so I will refer this to my colleague who specializes in criminal law. He will start by reporting the private investigators to the state board for misconduct, which should get their attention. The attorney explained, waving the 2 bank statements that showed Rick hired the PIs and Marcy bribed them. Josh, I assume your case is more complex, the attorney asked. Yes, I still have 1 child at home and minimal evidence apart from Penny's admission on the recording, Josh explained. We should be able to work with that. This state allows recordings of conversations if only one party is aware of it, the attorney assured. What should I expect, Josh inquired. You should be prepared for a 7-5-2-5 split in your favor, keeping the residency and primary custody of your child, the attorney replied. Of course, if your wife hires a good lawyer, the outcome may be different, but I doubt it. That sounds great. Just the divorce itself will be painful for her. I used to know her, or so I thought, Josh replied, shaking his head. He couldn't believe Penny's actions, but he had no tolerance for infidelity. When would you like the papers to be served? When they return, the attorney asked. Yes, exactly. Marcy requested that I not create a scene at the airport, so that's precisely what will happen. They'll be served at the airport upon arrival, Rick said, a mischievous smile on his face. Indeed, at the airport, Josh agreed. Very well, gentlemen. Please see my secretary on the way out to settle the retainer fee, the attorney instructed. They all shook hands and left the office. When it was time to pay, Rick pulled out a stack of $100 bills from his pocket and paid in cash. Mr. Washington, the secretary called when it was time for Josh to pay. Let me take care of it, Josh, Rick insisted, and began counting out $100 bills. What's going on, Josh asked, surprised. Don't worry, I'll explain later, Rick said, and continued counting the money, covering Josh's $2,000 retainer as well. The 2 men left and Rick drove out of town to the casino on the Native American reservation. I used the money from Marcy's secret bank account to pay the retainers, Rick stated. Once they were in the truck, both men burst into laughter. At the casino, Rick cashed one of the smaller cashier's checks from Marcy's bank for chips, and the 2 men went and had lunch at the buffet with the chip carrier. After 2 hours, he cashed the chips out for cash and left the casino. What was that all about, Josh asked, once they were back in the truck, headed back to town. Basically, I just cleaned that money, Rick explained. Cashed that check at the casino, and if anyone asks where that money went, I will tell them I lost it gambling as I was downcast, Rick concluded. Nice, Josh exclaimed. He slapped his knee and started laughing. Rick dropped Josh off at home and headed to his own house. Rick was surprised to see a Toyota Tacoma in the driveway with Virginia plates. He didn't recognize the truck. He opened the door to the smell of coffee, which surprised him. He cautiously walked through the house. He saw luggage in the living room, and then a woman he hadn't seen in years stepped out of the kitchen. Deidre Klein, Rick said, quietly. A smile brightened his face. Rick Weston, I want you to know that I love you, she said, as she walked toward him. I love you too, Deidre, he replied, just as she came to him. Rick took her into his arms as she wrapped her arms around his neck. I can't believe you're here, Rick said, as he looked into her blue-green eyes. I can't believe this is happening, Deidre commented. She craned her head up and pressed her lips to his. Rick was surprised as she hugged him, wanting to explore. Rick had planned on going to Dr. Trey's condo and seeing what was there, what he could use against the doctor. Then going to his own bank, dividing the marital assets and canceling Marcy's credit cards. What was happening in his living room was way better than messing with his soon-to-be ex-wife and her boyfriend. Rick knew that he could love Deidre with his whole heart and she would never hurt him, because she knew how he had already been hurt and was being hurt. He had shared his uncertainty about what his wife was doing while he was in Korea and how it had affected him. Deidre had understood his pain and knew what Rick would require in a relationship. She knew that it was just the opposite of what Marcy was doing now. Deidre knew she could be the new woman in Rick's life and that she would never let him down. Rick had talked to her about his feelings when they were together in Iraq. She knew he had tried to talk to Marcy about his feelings as well, as one of Deidre's discussions had been how frustrated Rick was that Marcy wouldn't talk to him about their feelings. Rick's hand reached her backside and he caressed her gently. Rick knew her backside was sensitive and he was taking full advantage of this information. Deidre pulled Rick closer and hugged him. As a CIF field operative, she was a strong, independent woman, and as such, she did enjoy letting go of control and feeling desired by the man she was with, the man she loved. Deidre was ready to give herself to Rick completely, without the fear of being hurt. After some time, Rick and Deidre got up. Rick prepared a delicious dinner for both of them while Deidre helped him in the kitchen. They couldn't keep their hands off each other, showing their affection. Rick thought this was how it should be. They enjoyed a nice glass of wine with dinner and had a pleasant conversation about their future together. They didn't talk about Marcy at all. The rest of the evening was spent packing up all of Marcy's belongings in the master bedroom and storing the boxes in the garage. Rick carefully removed Marcy's pictures from the house and placed them in boxes as well. He also gathered trinkets and mementos that reminded him of Marcy and put them in a separate box. These items reminded him of painful memories due to her betrayal. They also finished unloading Deidre's truck. She had moved all her valuable belongings in one trip. Once they finished unloading and putting away some of the items, Rick looked at Deidre. "Time to go to bed," she asked, a mischievous smile on her face. Rick took her hand and led her to the upstairs bedroom. Sleep wasn't the only thing on their minds during those couple of hours. Both Rick and Deidre were early risers, so Rick wasn't surprised when Deidre asked if she could join him on his morning run. They received some curious looks from people in the neighborhood, but Rick and Deidre just smiled and waved. Leslie, on the other hand, looked angry when she saw them together. She most likely felt threatened by the new woman in Rick's life. Even though Deidre was older, she was more fit than Leslie, which made it even worse for the younger woman. When they returned home, Rick and Deidre helped each other out of their sweaty clothes before heading to the shower. They got intimate in the shower. It was some time later when Rick and Deidre finally made their way downstairs for breakfast. Rick showed Deidre Marcy's letter and the pile of evidence his kids had collected regarding her affair while he was in Korea. Deidre had a few questions for Rick and carefully examined everything, taking notes on a legal pad. Rick finished cooking breakfast and placed the plate next to Deidre. He refilled her coffee, not wanting to interrupt her concentration. He knew it was best to have fresh eyes analyze any information, and he had considered Marcy his adversary since this whole situation began. Deidre ate her breakfast while scribbling in her notes. Once she finished her meal, she set her pen down. "It's pretty clear to me. She exhibits symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder. She always believes she is right and everyone else is wrong. She cannot handle being proven wrong, so she tries to destroy anyone or anything that challenges her. If she can't prove she's right and everyone else is wrong, she will remove herself from the situation. In extreme cases, people with this disorder can have suicidal tendencies, just like Hitler." Deidre shared her initial conclusion. Rick reached for her hand. "That's what I suspected. But I was too close to the situation to admit that I was married to a narcissist," Rick confessed. "But what about her admitting she's a coward for not confronting me? A narcissist wouldn't do that." Deidre intertwined her fingers with his and gently stroked his hand with her thumb. "It's just an anomaly. That's why I believe she doesn't fully fit the profile of narcissistic personality disorder," Deidre explained. "Okay, that makes sense," Rick agreed. "Her arrogance is her downfall. It's the reason she has made so many mistakes. She truly believes you'll take her back when she returns and that you'll continue to tolerate her infidelity." Deidre concluded her analysis. "Yeah, that's not going to happen," Rick said, chuckling. Rick checked his phone and saw a message from Marcy. The Doctors Without Borders team had been relocated to Peru. Marcy was still angry that the team was divided by gender in the hotel where they were staying. They were under strict surveillance by their security detail. Marcy accused Rick of ruining her hall pass. Rick and Deidre couldn't help but laugh as they listened to the message. They couldn't believe Marcy's lack of intelligence to leave such incriminating evidence to support Rick's case of mental cruelty against her. "What did you do about work?" Rick asked. "Oh, I retired. I was already vested. I also spoke to your boss about joining Gibraltar and pretty much got hired over the phone," Deidre said, grinning at him. "I'll be the assistant director of operational planning." "No way," Rick exclaimed. "What about me?" "No, I report directly to Steve," Deidre replied. Steve was the CEO of Gibraltar Securities. "This is fantastic," Rick said. He pulled Deidre close, hugged her. Rick went to the bank while Deidre went shopping for some clothes, using Marcy's money. Rick divided the assets in the joint account as advised by his attorney, keeping 90% for himself. He removed his name from all the joint accounts, paid off the credit cards, and lowered the spending limits to $500 each. He would cancel them later. Then, Rick opened new accounts in his own name and deposited his share. He even applied for a credit card in his name, even though he already had two. Rick picked up Deidre at the clothing store and headed back to the casino to cash the large cashier's check from Marcy's secret accounts and open an account there. He received $25,000 in chips, which he placed in a bag. They had lunch using Marcy's money before leaving the casino. "Aren't you going to cash in those chips?" Deidre asked when they were back in the truck. "Not today. I'll hold on to them for a few days and then gradually cash them out in smaller amounts over time. If anyone asks, I lost all the money gambling," Rick explained. Deidre couldn't stop chuckling as they arrived at the attorney's office to deliver the recording of Marcy's latest phone message. After that, they made a quick stop at Dr. Trey's condo. They were just doing a preliminary inspection and didn't plan to spend much time there. They discovered a key fob to a Mercedes and confirmed its location in the parking lot by pressing the lock button. Their findings didn't surprise them at all. Marcy had left several sets of clothes and expensive lingerie. Rick found some garbage bags under the kitchen sink, gathered Marcy's belongings, and threw them in the dumpster. It seemed that Marcy and Dr. Trey had been together for several months, which aligned with what Leslie had mentioned. They also found Dr. Trey's notebook containing computer passwords in his desk drawer, as well as more information about Marcy's brokerage accounts. Rick and Deidre contemplated making love in the doctor's bed, but decided to save that insult for another time. They made sure to lock up and began heading back home. Once home, Rick noticed that he had several messages on his old cell phone. One was from the administrator at the hospital in town where Marcy worked, asking him to get in touch. Another was from Marcy, questioning why Rick was being unfair and ruining her fun. "You have no idea what I'm going to do," Rick said as he listened. Rick called the hospital administrator back. "Mr. Weston, I'm glad you called me back. Dr. Mendez has informed me that there have been some improper activities occurring between the doctors and nurses on their trip to South America. We here at the hospital don't support such behavior and apologize for any distress this may be causing you," the gentleman began. Rick noticed that this guy was trying to manage the situation and protect the hospital. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name," Rick interrupted, smiling at the fact that the man hadn't introduced himself. "I'm sorry, I'm Samuel Mailer, the hospital's chief administrator. Dr. Mendez told me that you had some incriminating evidence and I was hoping that you could share that with us to protect the hospital," Sam requested, stating his argument directly. Rick appreciated that and decided to help the hospital as he believed it would expose the actions of the doctors and nurses involved. "I do have evidence of Marcy's plan and admission to break her marriage vows during the trip. Her intended partner is Dr. Trey Cardosa. I also have a recorded admission from Penny Washington, but I don't know who her partner was at the time," Rick explained. "We can assume it was Dr. Barnes until someone tells us otherwise, since he is the only other doctor on the team." "Oh boy," Sam exclaimed. "What's wrong?" Sam asked. "We have spent years building the best brain surgery team in the region, and now these doctors and nurses have ruined it." "I'm sorry, but it's frustrating." Sam struggled to control his anger. "What are you going to do?" Rick inquired. "I'm not sure yet. They have brought shame to us on an international level. Doctors Without Borders is considering canceling the rest of the trip. The surgical team gave our hospital prestige, and now they have caused a scandal. I think I might have to fire all of them and start assembling a new team, Sam stated. It sounded like he was thinking out loud. Are you planning to report them to the medical boards? Rick asked. Absolutely. I'm tired of their nonsense. I warned them, Sam exclaimed. You did? Rick questioned, wanting to know more about the situation. It seemed like there was more to this story. Well, Mr. Weston, you might not have been aware, but a few months ago your wife and Dr. Cardoso were caught in a compromising situation at the hospital. They were both warned and assured that it wouldn't happen again. A letter of reprimand was placed in their employment file, and I thought the issue was resolved, but apparently it wasn't, Sam explained. I'll need a copy of that, Rick said. And I'll need a copy of what you have, Sam agreed. All right, it's getting late now. I'll probably stop by with my stuff tomorrow, Rick offered. Just email what you have to my attorney, Rick added, providing his attorney's email address. Okay. Let me know when you're coming so I can be prepared, and I'll email you the documents when I get off the phone, Sam replied. Will do? Goodbye, Rick said. Goodbye and good luck, Sam ended the call. Wow, Deidre commented. So, the hospital was aware of it? Yeah, and they tried to address it, Rick replied. But it only made them move their activities outside of the hospital. Rick called Josh to share the information he had received from the hospital's chief administrator, indicating that Penny was likely involved with Dr. Barnes, as he was the only other doctor on the team. Thanks, Rick. Revenge will be easy in this case. Barnes is known for being a womanizer, and his wife has tried to keep him under control. I'll just give her a call and things will get interesting. It should be entertaining to watch. Josh chuckled. All right, buddy, I'm glad things are working out, Rick commented. Yeah, you too. Talk to you later, Josh said, ending the call. Before Rick and Deidre had dinner, he received a call from his attorney. Can you be in court tomorrow at 10, his attorney asked. Sure, what's going on, Rick wondered. I have a special hearing with the judge. Based on your case filing under mental cruelty and the evidence I have, we might be able to get you an immediate divorce. The judge requested the hearing after reviewing the evidence I provided. It's a good chance for us, Rick's attorney explained. Are you serious? Rick said, surprised. Yes, I've seen similar cases before, especially for abused individuals. But Marcy's behavior is excessive. I think we have a strong chance. The attorney elaborated. I'll see you at the courthouse tomorrow at 10, then Rick agreed. Arrive a little early, and I'll meet you there, the attorney instructed. See you there, Rick replied before ending the call. Rick looked at Deidre with a huge smile. Deidre smiled back. You could be divorced by tomorrow, she exclaimed, jumping into his arms. Rick embraced her, laughing. He had expected to wait months to be free from Marcy, but now there was a real possibility of gaining his freedom tomorrow. Rick was ecstatic with the news and wanted to celebrate with Deidre in a special way. He began kissing her neck and hugging her lovingly. The next morning, Rick met his attorney outside the courthouse. The attorney informed him that he had provided all the necessary documents to the judge the day before, so the judge could make a decision today if he wanted to. Inside the courtroom, the judge wasted no time in getting down to business. Another attorney, whom Rick didn't know, sat across from them. Colonel Weston, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your service. Our nation wouldn't be the beacon of freedom, and hope it is without men like you who defend it. Thank you. Your Honor, Rick replied, grateful for the compliment. In your photo, I see that you are wearing flight wings, but you're in a different branch that I'm not familiar with, the judge commented, referring to an official photo of Rick in uniform. Your Honor, I was a flight officer. I flew Apaches during Desert Storm, commanding an aviation troop. My wife was concerned about my safety, so I switched to intelligence, Rick explained. So, you sacrificed your aviation career for this woman, and this is how she treats you? The judge asked, showing a folder that Rick assumed contained evidence of Marcy's infidelity and her threatening letter. Apparently so, Your Honor, Rick replied. You also retired as a bird colonel. Were you on track to becoming a general? The judge inquired. Yes, Your Honor. I was being considered for general. But again, Marcy wanted me to retire. Rick explained. So, you sacrificed the opportunity to become a general in the United States Army for this woman, and she thinks you owe her something, the judge commented. I don't understand it either. Some experts who have analyzed her behavior suggest sociopathic or narcissistic tendencies. Rick explained, sharing what Deidre and he had concluded after assessing Marcy's behavior and writings. Considering the evidence, I agree. It's no wonder you want to be free from this situation, the judge commented, again waving the folder representing Marcy's actions. Thank you, Your Honor, Rick replied. I reviewed everything yesterday and again this morning. I believe filing for divorce under mental cruelty is appropriate and allows the court certain liberties. It grants an immediate divorce to you, Colonel Weston. Given that your ex-wife is out of the country, I am appointing Mr. Blackman as her attorney until she returns, the judge stated, gesturing towards Mr. Blackman. While there has been no wrongdoing by Ms. Weston, I can impose a financial penalty on her for her actions. I will grant the requested 90/10 split of assets in your favor, Colonel Weston. I am awarding the home to you, Colonel Weston, and after the house is paid off, then the division of assets will be made, the judge announced. Mr. Blackman, the attorney appointed to Marcy, did not react to any of these rulings from the judge. He made no effort to defend Marcy's legal position. Rick thought this was hilarious because the house had been refinanced to pay for Marcy's car, and now she was going to have to pay off the house. Rick debated telling the court about Marcy's secret accounts, but he had already closed them and started moving the money, so he decided this would be a bad idea. He had closed the accounts before the divorce filing, so his actions were actually legal as far as closing the accounts. He had just failed to report the funds in the bank accounts and jewelry as part of the marital assets. If asked, he could say that he had lost it gambling at the casino. The jewelry was another issue, as the sale of those items were on his online account, and if caught, Marcy could have an issue with it. Rick smiled when he realized all he had to do is say that he forgot to tell the court as the items hadn't sold yet, and when, if she did ask about her jewelry, he could just pay her 10% of what it had sold for online. Rick smiled to himself as the judge continued to speak. Rick did decide to tell the court about her brokerage accounts. Those could be liquidated to cover the cost of the house. Rick was granted an immediate divorce, and the judge insisted on issuing a restraining order to cover the court legally, if for no other reason. The judge knew he could not issue such a damning decision and then leave the victim of mental cruelty unprotected by the court. Rick gave Mr. Blackman all of Marcy's contact information, as well as his own. Mr. Blackman was pleasant and let Rick know he was doing this as a favor to the judge. The judge had helped Mr. Blackman out in a difficult divorce from a cheating spouse years before, and he was more than happy to return the favor to the judge. Rick left with the impression that Mr. Blackman was more on his side of this divorce than Marcy's, and his involvement was just to have everything handled properly in the proceedings. Rick did not walk out of the court divorced. That would only happen once the paperwork was filed with the county clerk, probably later that day or Monday. Rick walked out of the court and into Deidre's arms. She had been waiting around the corner in a cafe, as they thought it would be inappropriate for her to accompany him in the courtroom. Well, she asked. The judge granted the divorce, 90/10 split of assets, after the house is paid off and given to me. Rick exclaimed. He could barely contain his joy as he hugged Deidre and laughed. Do you want to mess with the doctor's stuff? Deidre asked. With the courts involved now, we are going to have to be careful, Rick commented. Good thing you know a spy, Deidre said, with a smirk, and then kissed him. Rick walked into the hospital's administration section and handed his evidence of Marcy's and Dr. Cardosa affair, as well as her previous affair, when he was in Korea. This would establish a pattern of behavior of surgical nurse Marcy Weston that could be used for whatever ends the hospital saw fit. Rick walked out with a huge smile on his face. On the way to the doctor's condo, Rick had an idea. Kyle, how would you like to come home for the weekend? There is someone special I would like you to meet, Rick said, over the speaker in his truck that was connected to his phone. Dad, you're not even divorced yet, Kyle commented. Not true, son. Judge just granted it, Rick said, laughing. No way, Kyle said, in disbelief. Yeah, my attorney filed on the grounds of mental cruelty, based on the letter your mom left, recordings of our phone conversations with your mom, and the evidence you provided, Rick said, giving Kyle the facts. Wow. And the judge granted an immediate divorce, Kyle asked. Yeah, under special circumstances. Appointed an attorney for your mom, made a decision and granted the divorce. It won't be official until it's filed with the county clerk, but your mom and I are divorced. Rick explained. So you busy this weekend, Rick asked, Again. Yeah, I can be down this evening, Kyle commented. How about we come pick you up, Rick suggested. I have some stuff to do up there later today, and then we can swing by and grab you. Sounds good. See you in a bit, Kyle replied. Bye, son. I love you, Rick said. I love you too, Dad, Kyle replied and hung up. What business do you have in the city? Deidre asked. Rick explained his plan and Deidre smiled her evil grin in response. At the doctor's condo, they did all the things you do to cause chaos. They unplugged the refrigerator and left the doors open, so all the food would spoil and stink up the place. With 5 weeks left before the doctor returned, the neighbors would soon be complaining to the condo's management about the smell. Everything in the freezer would melt and the water would leak out and ruin the floors and the carpet. Deidre spent her time at the doctor's computer. First, she changed all of his passwords and reset all his biometrics. She next started making contributions to charities from his banking and checking accounts, only leaving $1,000 in each account. It would be impossible to get the money back, even when they did prove he was out of the country, because he would look like a complete fool demanding money back from charities. Next, Rick was up, calling the doctor's insurance agent and complaining about the poor customer service he was receiving and canceling the policy because he was getting much better deal with another company. When the agent asked about him being in South America, Rick replied that he was still in South America but wanted to take care of this now. The agent agreed to cancel the policy on his car immediately. Deidre then worked her computer magic to embed an audio program in the computer that played the recording of Marcy's voice in a loop. The recording was from the first phone call Rick had made. He is not as good as you, and he does not measure up. Marcy's voice said over and over again throughout the house on the doctor's very expensive home audio system. Deidre had put the program in the operating software on the hard drive, and the only way to remove it was to replace or rewrite the hard drive. Any audio file on the computer or attached devices would automatically upload the audio file and start playing it. The only way to stop the audio file was to turn the device off. If the doctor plugged his fancy refrigerator in, it would start playing the audio file anytime he opened the door. He is not as good as you, and he does not measure up. He is not as good as you, and he does not measure up. He is not as good as you, and he does not measure up. Every smart device in the doctor's house would be infected with the audio file. His smartphone would play it as his ringtone. Rick and Deidre were laughing hysterically when they left the condo. They could still faintly hear the audio file playing through the home. The audio system with the door closed, and they were pretty sure on quiet nights, the neighbors would hear it too. Rick and Deidre got into their first argument in the parking lot of the doctor's condo. The argument was who was going to drive the doctor's Mercedes-AMG to the city. It didn't last long, as it was decided that they would take turns driving it, stopping at the rest area halfway to the city. Deidre had to wait several minutes at the rest area for Rick to catch up in his truck. While it was tight in the sports car, they did do it in the passenger seat at the rest area. Then Rick had to wait for Deidre at their planned meeting place in the city, as he had put the AMG through its paces. They left the doctor's car at Washington and 2nd Street, with the keys in it, and left in Rick's truck. The car would not sit there long before someone took it. They knew that the doctor would report it stolen when he returned, but would be very surprised to find out that he had canceled his insurance on the 6-figure sports car. Rick and Deidre were still laughing when they went to the college campus to pick up Kyle. Kyle was in his dorm room when they arrived, and he was not alone. Constance had her arm around Kyle when he opened the door. "Hey Dad, this is Constance," Kyle said in introduction. Rick shook Constance's hand. "Kyle, Constance, this is Deidre," Rick said, introducing Deidre to his son and his son's girlfriend. They all shook hands in greeting. "Dad, can Constance come home with us?" Kyle asked. Rick already saw that both had bags packed and sitting on the bed. "Sure, Kyle, it should be a fun weekend." "Let's go get dinner," Rick said. The two couples left the dorm and headed to Rick's truck. They had dinner at a very nice restaurant. Of course, Rick paid with Marcy's cash. Back at home, Rick and Deidre went to their bedroom, and Kyle took Constance to his room. Rick and Deidre talked into the night about what a wonderful evening they had and how well everyone had gotten along. Kyle was happy to meet Deidre and happy his dad had someone special in his life. His mother had done a decent job taking care of his sister and him, but she had not always been good to their father. His father deserved to have someone that respected him, loved him, and made him happy, like Deidre apparently did. Saturday evening, the neighbors had a barbecue like they had 2 weeks before. Everyone was surprised to see Rick there with a woman that was not Marcy. Rick had invited Josh along, and almost immediately Jenny was talking to the firefighter. Rick took great pleasure in introducing Deidre to everyone and informing them that he and Marcy were divorced. Leslie and Vincent were particularly surprised to hear about the divorce and were curious how it could have happened so fast. Rick smiled when he told them that the divorce had been granted on the grounds of mental cruelty. Leslie was shocked. Vincent smiled back at Rick, knowing Rick had done the right thing in response to Marcy's actions. By the end of the barbecue, everyone knew that Marcy was cheating on Rick in South America, and Rick had divorced her almost immediately under special circumstances. Rick knew that by the end of next week, the entire town would know what had happened between Rick and Marcy. Josh's older son played with Jenny's kids like they were already siblings. Josh's son chased the younger children around the big yard and then up and down the street. He then helped put her kids to bed so his dad could spend some time with Jenny. Rick watched as Josh and Jenny shared a lingering hug goodbye when their evening was over. Rick emailed his daughter, Rhonda, letting her know that he and her mother were divorced and how it had happened so quickly. He told her that he would keep the house and she was welcome there any time. Rick watched the interaction of Kyle and Constance and thought that maybe his son had found a woman that would make a good partner for him in life. The trip taking Kyle and Constance back to college Sunday night was filled with lively conversation and laughter. Rick left Kyle with $1,000 in cash, letting him know it was from Marcy's secret accounts and that more was available if he spent it wisely. Rick told his son that he thought Constance was a nice young woman and that Kyle should treat her well, when appropriate. The two men laughed at his father's joke. Rick believed in treating women with respect in public, but not so much in private if they wanted it that way, and his son agreed. Monday morning, Rick received a call from his attorney, letting him know that he was officially divorced. His attorney informed Rick that Mr. Blackman had sent Marcy an email, letting her know that the divorce was final. Mr. Blackman's email concluded by informing Marcy that there was a restraining order against her, and she was not allowed to have contact with Rick until further notice. Rick couldn't help but laugh as he hung up the phone, excited to share the news with Deidre. Rick turned on his old phone and noticed that he had a message from Marcy on it. He chuckled, realizing that this was a violation of her restraining order, but also considered that she probably hadn't received the email from Mr. Blackman yet. Marcy skipped back to her hotel room in Lima, Peru. She had a spring in her step. Lately, everyone in the group of doctors and nurses had been upset with her because they knew she was the reason behind their restricted status. They were not allowed to do much outside of work after receiving a lecture from Dr. Mendez in Bogota. Marcy had been avoiding everyone else by having her meals in her room each evening. However, today was going to be different. She had called Rick before leaving for the hospital, threatening him with divorce and demanding he call Dr. Mendez to withdraw his threat. She also mentioned that they had an open marriage. If he didn't comply within a few days, she threatened to file for divorce as soon as she returned. "You can't win this, Rick. I'll take half of everything, including your precious military retirement. So just enjoy Leslie for now, but we'll go back to being husband and wife once I'm back," she concluded the message, feeling smug, then hung up the phone and headed to the hospital. Marcy looked for signs throughout the day that things had changed, but she didn't notice any. The security detail was still there, and when she tried to access the floor reserved for male staff members, she was promptly directed to go back to her own floor by security personnel. Somewhat perplexed, Marcy returned to her room. She was sure Rick would react immediately to her threat, as he loved her and wanted to stay married. He had made many sacrifices for her in the past, such as leaving the army and stopping his flying career. She believed he would allow her to have this affair and things would go back to normal once she returned. Her normal included sleeping with Dr. Trey when she felt like it while Rick took care of her. As she thought about sleeping with Rick again, she realized it had been a while since their last intimate moment. In fact, it had been at least a month, if not 6 weeks, since she had become more involved with her affair with Dr. Trey. Oh no, Rick has to know. Marcy panicked. She had been so caught up in her affair that she had neglected her husband. But it couldn't be her fault, she reasoned. He should have addressed the issue. Marcy's ego battled with her rational mind. What would Rick say? "Gee, Marcy, you're not giving me attention because you're giving it to someone else. care to share some with your husband, but this wasn't her fault. It was his, because he hadn't been attentive enough. If he had shown attention to her, he would have received his fair share. Fair share? Rick was her husband. There shouldn't have been a need for shares. Marcy's thoughts raced as she tried to convince herself that she was justified. Unable to come to a rational conclusion where she was right, she decided she needed a drink. She changed her clothes and went down to the hotel bar, one of the few places the team was allowed to visit. While at the bar, Marcy noticed Penny Washington, Josh's wife, sitting alone at a table, sipping a glass of wine. Marcy ordered a drink from the bartender and asked for it to be delivered to Penny's table. "Mind if I join you?" Marcy asked as she approached Penny. "Sure, I have a feeling you and I are going to be spending a lot of time alone together when we get home," Penny replied, her voice laced with anger. "What do you mean?" Marcy asked with a slight laugh as she took a seat. "You clueless fool. Our husbands are going to divorce us. You idiot." Marcy was shocked, as she had never heard Penny use such language before. The bartender brought Marcy her drink. "Both of our husbands are strong men, the type of men who face challenges head-on. Do you really think they'll sit back and do nothing about our actions?" Rick already took action. He called Dr. Mendez and threatened to harm the funding of Doctors Without Borders using his connections in the CIA. "Do you even realize who your husband is? He was an Army colonel, a ranger, an attack helicopter pilot turned spy. He was on his way to becoming a general until he gave it all up for you. And what did he get in return? You decided to sleep with other people. What kind of deal is that for him?" Penny paused, taking a sip of wine. Marcy was speechless. "I've been trying to contact Josh every day since Rick's call, but I haven't received any response. Rick is a man of honor. He promised not to say anything to Josh if I connected him with you in Trey's room. But since I'm the one who cheated, I can't assume that Rick feels obligated to keep his promise to me since I showed no honor. I'm certain he told Josh about the man in my room." Penny fell silent for a moment. "Marcy, our husbands are going to hold us accountable. We'll likely return home to find divorce papers filed against us, and our careers may be ruined." Penny finished speaking and took another sip of wine. "No, Rick wouldn't do that to me. He loves me," Marcy said after a long pause, trying to convince herself. "Marcy, you're not thinking clearly. You have no idea who your husband truly is. He has made countless sacrifices for you, and now you demand the ultimate sacrifice from him without expecting any reaction. Maybe you're not thinking clearly, maybe you're just being foolish. I know I made a mistake by going along with you. Now I'll lose my husband and have limited time with my children. Thank you for being such a terrible friend." Penny glared at Marcy, anger evident in her eyes. "Everything will be fine," Marcy replied, still smiling. "Rick is involved with Leslie, but he'll take me back with open arms when we return. Josh will get over his anger, and you and him will be all right. Eventually, Mendez will relax and we can resume our affairs with the doctors." "Marcy, you're being ignorant. You haven't been listening to anything I said. My husband is not talking to me, and yours is clearly angry and ignoring your calls and emails. You need to snap out of it and understand just how badly you messed up. Have you ever taken any psychology classes? Because you're missing some major signs here, and it's going to cost you." Penny was beyond furious at Marcy's inability to comprehend the gravity of the situation she had created. "Penny, calm down. Everything will be fine. I threatened Rick with divorce, and that should set him straight. If you call Josh and leave a similar message, I'm sure everything will work out." Marcy smiled as she finished her wine. "Marcy, you're a fool. I'm resigning from the team tomorrow and going back home to salvage my marriage," Penny nearly shouted as she stood up and stormed out of the bar. She would have thrown her wine at Marcy, but her glass was empty. Marcy sat alone, reflecting on what Penny had said. Her thoughts mixed with those she had before coming to the bar, and doubt crept in once again. She ordered another glass of wine, wishing there was someone around to be intimate with. She even considered sleeping with Rick, which surprised her. She questioned herself, wondering if there was something wrong with her thoughts. After finishing her second glass of wine, Marcy bought another bottle and headed back to her room. Deep down, Marcy knew her husband. Even if she didn't fully understand the situation, she believed that he would stand by her in the end because he loved her. She was confident that she could continue her affair with Dr. Trey once she returned, and Rick would be okay with it. Her threats of leaving in the letter were just to ensure he wouldn't make any impulsive decisions like filing for divorce. In her room, Marcy poured herself another glass of wine and opened her laptop to check her emails. She saw the usual junk mail, which she quickly sorted through. There was an email from the hospital human resources department and one from Mr. Blackman, the attorney. She would look at those later. She also noticed emails from her secret bank account and brokerage company that Rick didn't know about. There was an email from the bank they had joint accounts with and one from the mortgage company for their home. She also received an email from Leslie, the neighbor she had set Rick up with to keep him entertained while she was away. Surprisingly, there were no emails from Rick or their children. Marcy was taken aback. Rick should have been begging for her forgiveness after she threatened him with divorce, doing everything he could to win her back. Curiosity got the best of her, and Marcy decided to open Leslie's email first. Perhaps it contained evidence of her affair with Rick that she could use against him. She also secretly hoped to find pictures of Rick and Leslie together, giving her more leverage in the future. The thought of Rick and Leslie being together was starting to bother Marcy. It had been a while since she had been in a relationship, and she couldn't help but feel a little jealous. She absent-mindedly touched her breast, regretting her decision to get enhancements as it had affected her sensitivity. She started to fantasize about Rick and Leslie, but then she got frustrated. Rick was ruining her plans for some alone time. She was angry that he had told Dr. Mendez about their secret arrangement. Marcy stopped thinking about that and focused on the email she received. Marcy opened the email and was disappointed to find that there were no pictures or any evidence against Rick. The email was confusing. Marcy, you messed up big time. I went to your house as we planned, but you didn't talk to Rick before leaving. He was angry after talking to you on the phone and finding out about our plans from me and the letter you gave me. He was polite, but he asked me to leave after reading the letter. I haven't talked to him until tonight, Saturday at the Goldstein's party, which was similar to the one we had before you left. Rick was telling everyone that you two are getting a divorce due to mental cruelty. He said the judge granted an immediate divorce because of your letter, which was considered evidence. I'm sorry, Marcy, but it looks like you are officially divorced. Penny, your friend who works as a nurse, was at the party with her husband. It seems like he also filed for divorce and was getting along with our neighbor Jenny. Their kids were having a great time together. The court appointed an attorney for you, so expect to hear from them soon. Everything is legal, so I'm not sure what you can do. The hospital is also aware of the situation, so it's unclear what will happen there. You should have talked to Rick before leaving. Take care, Leslie. Marcy couldn't believe what she was reading. It had to be a joke, right? Rick would never leave her. She was an accomplished woman and had attracted a successful brain surgeon who was younger than her. Marcy was one of the best surgical nurses in the country, and Rick was lucky to have her. This had to be a prank between Rick and Leslie. Marcy shook her head and moved on to the next important email. She noticed an email from the hospital human resources department stating that she needed to attend a disciplinary hearing upon her return. It didn't specify the reason, but Marcy had a good idea. She had been reprimanded before for her involvement with Dr. Trey at work, but she thought it would be difficult to prove a pattern of behavior based on just one incident and Rick's unreliable evidence about their time in South America. Marcy found the situation ridiculous and thought that some hospital administrators could be foolish. She received another email from Mr. Blackman, which she believed was part of Rick and Leslie's joke. But as she read through the divorce papers, it started to seem more serious. The split of property in Rick's favor, the restraining order attachment, and the mention of her secret brokerage account made her realize this might not be a joke after all. She examined the documents closely and realized it might be real. The judge's findings described her in a negative light, and Marcy began to panic. But she was determined to fix the situation. Marcy checked her email from the bank, only to discover that her secret account had been closed and the safe deposit box emptied. She cried when she realized that her precious jewelry, gifted to her by Trey, was now in Rick's possession. Feeling her self-worth shattered, Marcy poured herself another glass of wine. She opened an email from her brokerage company, which informed her that her accounts would be liquidated as part of the divorce settlement. And confused about how Rick found out about this account, She then checked her joint bank accounts. To her dismay, Rick had removed her name from the accounts and took 90% of the funds. The credit cards were also paid off and had their limits drastically reduced. Finally, Marcy received an email from the mortgage company stating that the mortgage would be paid off as per the court order, and Rick would be the sole owner of their home. Overwhelmed by everything, Marcy broke down in tears. She felt like her worth had been stripped away, and the tokens that made her feel special were now in the hands of her tormentor. She wiped her eyes and drank more wine. As Marcy was about to give up, she received one last email from her son Kyle. It showed pictures of Rick and Deidre together, looking happy and in love. Marcy realized that her marriage was truly over, and she couldn't do anything about it. She finished her wine and fell asleep, feeling defeated. Rick listened to Marcy's phone message and burst into laughter, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't wait to share it with Deidre, but when he tried to speak, all that came out was more laughter. Eventually, Deidre joined in on the laughter, unable to resist the infectious joy. The next morning, Penny informed Dr. Mendez that she needed to go home and work on her marriage. He explained that she would have to stay until a replacement arrived, which would likely happen within the next couple of days. Penny left the doctor's office feeling relieved that the whole team would be replaced, as she was tired of working with unfaithful colleagues. Rick received a call from his attorney, who informed him that the private investigators he had hired in Korea had lost their licenses due to unethical behavior. Rick decided against suing them, as having their licenses revoked was punishment enough. Dr. Mendez gathered the medical team in the hotel conference room the next morning to announce that they would all be replaced. The rest of the team immediately turned on Marcy, Dr. Trey Cardosa, Dr. Barnes, and Penny, accusing them of misconduct. Dr. Mendez was satisfied, as this confirmed his suspicions. He only needed to replace the 4 culprits, and their replacements were already on their way. After the meeting, Marcy rode in the van with Trey and some other team members on their way to the hospital. "Hey Trey, maybe we can take a detour and spend the next 4 weeks together," Marcy suggested in a hushed voice. "Trey, I can't. I need to focus on salvaging my career. Plus, someone burned my car and broke into my condo," Trey replied, his voice filled with disappointment. "But Trey, I never said that about Rick." "It must have been a fake recording," Marcy pleaded. "I heard it myself, Marcy." "This relationship has become a disaster," Trey said, shaking his head. "Don't worry, once we get back, I'll talk to Rick and everything will be fine," Marcy assured him. "I doubt it," Trey responded, ignoring her for the rest of the trip. Josh Washington finished his shift at the fire station and checked his email when he got home. To his surprise, he found an email from Penny, stating that she would be returning early. It included her flight information, meaning she would soon find out about their impending divorce. Josh couldn't help feeling a sense of anticipation. Josh contacted his attorney to arrange for someone to serve Penny with the divorce papers at the airport. He also called Rick to inform him that Penny was on her way back. Rick received an email the next morning, notifying him that Marcy would be arriving the following day. She had been replaced on the medical team and was being sent home. Marcy still wanted to meet Rick at the hotel to discuss their relationship further. "Can you believe this?" Rick exclaimed, pointing at the email as Deidre read it over his shoulder. "She's completely out of touch with reality," Deidre commented. "What do you plan to do?" "I've been thinking about it a lot," Rick began, standing up and pacing as he spoke. "Instead of retaliating, I want to take the high road." "What do you mean?" Deidre asked, captivated by his strategizing. "I want to have her car detailed, return it to the airport parking area, and leave a copy of the divorce papers and evidence against her on the passenger seat, along with the first settlement check," Rick explained, smiling at Deidre. She stood up and stepped into his arms. "That sounds clever," Deidre commented, kissing Rick. Penny Washington felt extremely anxious as she disembarked from the plane and walked through the airport. She hadn't spoken to Josh since her first night in Bogota and had no idea what to expect. She had called him as planned but had to kick Dr. Barnes out when Rick interrupted their conversation. The rest of her time in South America was miserable, and now she was stepping into the unknown. Outside of security, she saw no one waiting for her and felt disappointed, hoping for a surprise from Josh. After collecting her luggage, she spotted a chauffeur holding a placard with her name on it and grew excited. Perhaps Josh did have a surprise for her. She approached the chauffeur. "I'm Penny Washington," she said. "Thank you, ma'am." "You've been served," the process server announced, handing her a manila folder. Penny stood there in shock, struggling to understand what was happening. The process server snapped a picture of her holding the folder and left Penny standing alone. Josh watched from a distance as Penny's world came crashing down. He didn't take pleasure in her pain, but wanted her to feel a fraction of what he had felt over the past 2 weeks. Part of him wanted to rush to her, forgive her, and alleviate her pain, but that part was small. After 23 years of loyalty, this is how she repaid him: by cheating. Josh had plenty of opportunities to cheat but never did, because he loved Penny and despised infidelity. He watched as Penny fumbled for her phone. Josh's phone rang, and for some reason, he decided to answer it. Penny had no idea he was at the airport. "Hello, Penny," he greeted. "Josh, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I don't want a divorce," Penny pleaded. "I wanted a wife who would remain faithful." "It seems neither of us got what we wanted," Josh stated. "Josh, please let me come home. We can work through this," Penny begged. "No, Penny. You know how I feel about cheating. There's no working through this, no going back." Josh replied with a dull tone. He had entered a mental state he went to when dealing with difficult situations, where he detached himself emotionally. "Josh, please," Penny pleaded. Josh ended the call on his cell phone and left Penny to her own thoughts. On his way home, Josh called Rick to update him on what happened with Penny at the airport. Rick wasn't surprised and understood that Josh needed to talk to someone for reassurance. "Do you really want to worry about Penny being unfaithful again? You know Jenny won't do that to you." Rick reasoned. "You're right. Good point," Josh agreed with a chuckle, thinking about how things had developed with Jenny. "Talk to you later," Rick said after a moment of silence. "Take care and stay safe." "Talk to you later," Josh replied before hanging up. Marcy and Dr. Barnes hardly spoke during their entire trip back from South America. Marcy had made a move on him 2 years ago, and Dr. Barnes could see that she wanted more than just a casual relationship. He noticed her arrogance and believed she was seeking a serious commitment to boost her self-esteem. Dr. Barnes found it frustrating that Marcy was married to a retired Army colonel who could have been a general if she hadn't been so selfish. Now, he had a high-ranking executive position in a multinational, multi-million-dollar company, which clearly surpassed the status of a surgical nurse. Dr. Barnes believed that Rick truly deserved better than Marcy. Moreover, he hoped he could salvage his own career and marriage from this whole mess. As soon as Marcy turned on her phone after stepping off the plane, it started ringing with a call from the hospital. They informed her that her disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following day at 1 p.m. She tried joking about needing a few days off because of her travel, but they firmly declined. Marcy's phone rang again, and it was Penny. "I just called to warn you. Josh served me with divorce papers at the airport yesterday. Be prepared," Penny said before hanging up. Rick had promised not to cause a scene at the airport, or maybe I told him not to, and he never agreed. Marcy thought to herself. Marcy headed to the baggage claim, and everything seemed calm. She collected her luggage and noticed a sheriff's deputy approaching her, holding a picture of her. "Are you Marcy Weston?" he asked. "Yes, I am," Marcy replied, feeling puzzled. "The court has issued a restraining order, which prevents you from contacting or coming in contact with Mr. Rick Weston, your former husband, in any way. A lawyer should have contacted you by now," the deputy stated. He handed Marcy a copy of the restraining order and left. Marcy stood there, holding her luggage, feeling utterly confused. She couldn't make sense of any of this in her mind, so she decided to go find her car. She believed she had parked it further down the row in long-term parking, but she chose not to worry about it. Surprisingly, it was impeccably clean, as if it had just been detailed. Marcy wondered if Rick had taken it and had it cleaned as an apology. She loaded her luggage into the trunk, got into the driver's seat, and noticed a flat gift box with a ribbon and bell on the passenger seat. Assuming it was another gift from Rick, she eagerly opened it. To her surprise, all she found was papers and a key with a tag. Marcy sifted through the papers and realized they included another copy of the restraining order, her final divorce decree, and a few photos that fell onto her lap. She set the papers aside and examined the photos. They were older pictures of her engaging in inappropriate behavior with Dr. Brian Morris, a pediatrician at the hospital. These photos were from 8 years ago, during the time Rick was stationed in Korea. Marcy wondered why this was suddenly an issue. However, a 3x5 card among the photos provided the answer. Marcy, these photos of your affair while I was in Korea were found by our children when they were 11 and 13 years old. How could you expose them to such a situation? Although you took care of them while I was away, you are an awful mother for subjecting them to this. Don't be surprised if the kids limit their contact with you in the future. Rick the Key had a tag with an address and a storage unit number. Marcy absent-mindedly looked at the paperwork for the storage unit and realized that Rick had rented it in her name for 2 months. She assumed that all her belongings were now in that unit. Marcy packed everything back into the box, feeling numb and unsure of what to do. She decided to stick to her original plan and went to the Ambassador Hotel, where she was supposed to meet Rick. However, he never showed up. She called his phone, only to hear a recording that it was no longer in service. During Marcy's disciplinary hearing, Dr. Trey Cardoso arrived at the airport. They had traveled together, so he was unsure of how he would get home. Taking a taxi to his condo turned out to be quite expensive. When he entered his condo, he noticed a foul smell. Marcy's voice filled his home speakers, repeatedly saying, "His personality isn't better than yours, and he has a smaller persona." It took him 20 minutes to realize that he needed to unplug his computer to make it stop. He opened all the windows and disposed of all the spoiled food in garbage bags, which he then took to the dumpster. After an hour, the condo still smelled terrible, so he decided to call another taxi and spend the night in a hotel. Since his disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the next day, he called Marcy to check what had happened to her. "Hey, how did your hearing go today?" Trey inquired. "Gee, thanks for being there for me," Marcy replied sarcastically. "Marcy, I was on a plane," Trey explained empathetically. He realized she was being unreasonable. "I expected you to be there for me," Marcy continued. "I'm sorry. So how did it go?" Trey asked, trying to gather information and accommodate Marcy's feelings. "Well, I'm not fired, but I'm on probation until I can find a new job somewhere else. I won't receive any references, and my pay will be reduced," Marcy explained in a defeated tone. "Wow, okay. Did you manage to resolve things with Rick?" Trey asked, even though he knew it was a foolish question. "No," Marcy replied quietly. "He immediately divorced me. He took all my money and jewelry, and it's all your fault," she accused. "How is it my fault? You never said no once," Trey countered. "You were always there. If it wasn't you, it would have been someone else, just like with Dr. Morris," Marcy shouted over the phone, referring to her previous affair. Marcy simply hung up after Trey's final comment. Ironically, Marcy found herself staring at the wall of her room in the Red Roof Inn across from the hospital. She had no idea what to do. Her husband refused to talk to her, so she couldn't reconcile with him. She was on the verge of losing her job, had lost her home and all her money, and her cherished jewelry was gone with no idea how to retrieve it. On top of all that, her boyfriend didn't drop everything to solve her problems. As Marcy drove past her old home, she witnessed Rick and Deidre acting like a couple. Despite the restraining order and the divorce, Marcy believed that she could win him back if she just had the chance to talk to him. Dr. Trey Cardoso no longer worked full-time at the hospital after his disciplinary hearing. They kept him on as a consultant until they found a suitable replacement. Trey anticipated this outcome, as it was the same that occurred with Dr. Barnes after his hearing. This wasn't Dr. Barnes' first incident, so the board was unforgiving. Trey was relieved that he wasn't in Dr. Barnes' position since his wife was divorcing him with evidence from his previous affairs. If Dr. Barnes found a new job, he would likely end up paying most of his salary in alimony and child support. Penny Washington did not have a disciplinary hearing because she hadn't caused any embarrassment to Doctors Without Borders or the hospital. However, a letter of reprimand was placed in her employment file as her conduct was deemed morally inappropriate for the hospital's policies. Penny was aware of Josh's stance on infidelity before she left, but Marcy had convinced her to have an affair while they were away. Marcy assured Penny that Josh would never find out, but now Penny was caught in the aftermath. The two private investigators took losing their licenses quite hard. They had just started their agency when Rick approached them, and they desperately needed the money. When Marcy came to them with more money, asking them to lie to Rick about their findings, they couldn't resist the temptation. They were confident that Rick would never find out, given that he was in Korea at the time. However, the husband showed up in court with evidence that they had neglected to collect and deliver, exposing failure in their services. They were determined to get back at Rick for the revenge that had ruined their careers. They utilized their expertise in gathering information. They discovered that Marcy had been caught cheating on Rick once again, resulting in their divorce. They also found out about her affair with Dr. Trey Cardosa, who was still employed at the hospital until a replacement could be found. One investigator made sure Rick was home by checking if both his and his girlfriend's vehicles were in the driveway. Satisfied that Rick was home, he called the other investigator, who was waiting for Dr. Cardosa to leave the hospital. The first investigator drove to the hospital to join the other in waiting for the doctor. Dr. Cardosa was leaving the hospital. He knew his time practicing medicine in the U.S. was probably numbered because he was pending another disciplinary hearing. This time from the state licensing board, and the first hearing had been a disaster. His finances were in ruin. He was still on the hook for his car that had been stolen and torched. He had received countless letters from all the charities he had donated to, thanking him for his generous donations. On top of all this, he hadn't been able to find a romantic partner in weeks. He didn't see the two men approach him and only knew they were there when the baseball bat hit him in the kidneys. Dr. Trey Cardosa woke in the same hospital he worked at, light assaulting his eyes. He tried to inhale deeply and winced in pain. He knew his ribs were broken, but was thankful that he seemed to be drugged. He tried to move his right hand, but it was in a cast. Then he tried to move his left hand, and it was in a cast too. He looked around the room and saw a nurse sitting in a chair, reading a magazine. "Nurse," he tried to say. It came out barely as a whisper, but it was enough for her to hear and look up. "You're awake," she commented as she stood. She pressed the call button by the bed and looked over the doctor quickly. "Here, let me give you something to drink. I'm sure your mouth is dry," the nurse said, as she brought up a glass of water to his face and aimed a straw to his lips. "Thank you," Trey said, after he drank most of the glass and wet his mouth. "Rick Weston do this to me?" he asked. "No, but I think you should talk to the police about that," the nurse replied. Trey was really confused. If Rick didn't beat him up, then who did? A resident came in and checked him over, Doctor. Trey was not being well taken care of by the hospital staff. "What are my injuries?" Trey asked. "I think Dr. Inez is going to talk to you about those, Dr. Cardosa," the nurse replied, as she continued to try to make him comfortable. The resident ignored his question. "The psychiatrist?" Trey exclaimed. "They only had the psychiatrist talk to you about your injuries when they were life-altering." Looking at the casts on his hands, he was pretty sure that he was done being a brain surgeon, but his involvement with Marcy and his actions in South America had already seen to that. He wondered if there was anything else. He noticed the excessive bandaging around his groin and wondered how serious those injuries were going to be. Trey was contemplating his future for some time. The resident left after making some notes on his chart. Detective Baker was one of 3 detectives for the sheriff's department and knew all about the role that Dr. Cardosa had played in Rick and Marcy's divorce. He did have some sympathy for the doctor, because his beating had nothing to do with getting involved with Rick's wife and the fact that his injuries were so severe. "Dr. Cardosa, I'm Detective Baker. I'm the lead investigator into your assault, and I am happy to say that we have both men in custody," he said, introducing himself. "Marcy and Penny's husbands?" Trey asked. The nurse looked at him, annoyed that he didn't believe her. "No, 2 former private investigators that were trying to frame Rick for your assault," the detective explained. "I don't understand," the doctor asked. The detective explained how the 2 PIs had lost their licenses and blamed Rick. The PIs came up with a scheme to frame Rick for assault by beating the doctor and Rick having no credible alibi. He said the assault was made to look like it had been done by a jealous partner, focusing on Trey's groin and his hands because he was a surgeon. The PIs failed on 2 accounts. Rick was not home as they thought. He and Deidre had been picked up that night in a limousine to have dinner in the city with the judge, along with Josh and Jenny. The second failure was the Red Roof Inn had a security camera that recorded the assault, as well as the license plates of both of the PI's cars. The detective proudly said he had the two PIs in custody in 6 hours after the assault. When the detective finished speaking, Dr. Inez was standing by the door. Thanks, Detective Trey said. The crime against him would not go unpunished. You get better, Detective Baker said as he left. Bob, Trey said, greeting Dr. Inez as he entered the room. Trey, I've been telling you for quite a while, your decisions were going to get you in trouble, Doctor. Bob Inez jumped into the psychology of his patient. Yeah, but not like this, Trey protested. Collateral damage, but your actions did instigate events. If you had made better choices, you wouldn't be here, Doctor. Inez reasoned. He had been trying to get Dr. Trey Cardosa to understand that his actions had consequences, but was having a hard time because of the doctor's inflated ego. I think it is ironic that Rick didn't come after me, himself, Trey commented. You're lucky he didn't. You would have disappeared. You and Marcy have no idea who he is. He does contract work for the CIA with that security company that he works for. He could make you both disappear, and none of the evidence would have ever pointed to him. Doctor. Inez explained. Oh, was all Trey said. He didn't have any idea who Rick was. He just assumed he was the better man because he was involved with his wife. You have to understand, you are nothing to Rick Weston. You didn't take his wife from him. She made a decision he was not involved in, and once she made that decision, he was done with her. Rick Weston moved on with his life from that moment, and from what I understand is in a relationship that is far better than his marriage ever was. Marcy seems to have some serious psychological issues, as I am sure you are aware of now. Dr. Inez explained. No, I won against Rick Weston. He came after me. He entered my condo, thrashed it, hacked my computer, gave all my money away to charity. I think he stole my car and abandoned it in the city after he canceled my insurance. I'm still paying off that loan. Trey concluded. He reasoned Rick was striking out in anger. Dr. Inez was laughing. Yes, it appears you won. You got involved with his wife and he completely messed up your life. You won, Doctor. Inez said with complete sarcasm. Trey stared at Dr. Inez blankly. His brain was reevaluating his situation and what he had experienced over the last 6 months. Your hands are crushed. It is very doubtful you will ever operate again. You have had one testicle removed, the other is severely damaged. You have extensive nerve damage to your genitals. You have one kidney that is severely damaged and may not recover. And you have 3 broken ribs. Yeah, Trey, you won, Doctor. Inez continued. He was trying to crack Trey's ego without crushing him. It was a fine line, and he didn't know how successful he would be. Trey remained silent. Doctor. Inez glanced at the monitors to see how Trey was physically reacting. You have insurance for your hands, right, Doctor? Inez asked a question to try and pull Trey out of his stupor. Yeah, I do, Trey said after a moment. The question seemed to startle him. Good, I also understand that he did something to your phone, Doctor, Inez asked, wanting to continue to engage Trey and have him discuss some of the things Rick had done to him in order to get him to understand he was only human. Yeah, Trey started laughing. He put something on my computer that got into my phone. It was a recording of Marcy telling Rick that his anatomy was bigger. It became my ringtone and I couldn't get it out. I had to throw away my smartphone and get another one. It invaded everything that had an audio file in my house, but my audio system, my smart fridge. I had a frat brother look at it and he said it was a military-grade worm. I actually had to throw away my computer at home. Trey stopped speaking to reflect. So did you win versus Rick Weston? Doctor. Inez asked softly. He wanted his patient reach his own conclusion so that he could move forward with his life. No, Bob, I didn't, Trey admitted. Rick Weston is the better man, that's not the point, Trey. Doctor. Inez countered. Rick Weston is not a brain surgeon and did not lead one of the best brain surgery teams in the area. I'm no longer a brain surgeon, Trey countered. He gestured towards his hands. Trey, you are still a doctor and you can still teach and consult, Doctor. Inez reasoned. Yeah, I can, Trey said. Suddenly, he had a new direction in life. So you see, this isn't the end of the world. Doctor. Inez affirmed. Yeah, I can see that, Trey replied. Truthfully, considering what he had done and what had happened as a result, things were not as bad as they could be. To start, he could be dead. He had underestimated Rick Weston in a very bad way, and now considered himself lucky that Rick had just messed with his finances, his condo, and his car. These were all material things that he could replace. Rick was not responsible for the injuries he had received. Trey swore off getting involved with married individuals from that moment on. Too risky. You are going to need new goals in your life, so you have focus in your recovery. Think about that, and I will see you tomorrow. Therapy is going to be an important part of your recovery, doctor. Inez informed him. I will, Bob. See you tomorrow, Trey replied. What about Marcy? Is she seeing you? Trey asked, curious if Marcy was in therapy. No, Trey. I was there as an observer for her disciplinary hearing, and she showed either narcissistic behavior or is a sociopath. Without her being my patient, I am reluctant to make a definitive diagnosis. Doctor. Inez answered. Okay, thanks, Bob, Trey said, staring out the window. He was done with Marcy, so he was thinking about his future, not being a surgeon. Doctor. Trey Cardosa's next visitor scared the heck out of him. He woke to see Rick Weston standing at the foot of his bed. Rick smiled at him. Trey was completely defenseless, having both arms in casts. Trey looked over to see the nurse still sitting there reading her magazine. Trey, I'm really sorry this happened to you, and there are no hard feelings. Rick started speaking in a low voice. If Marcy hadn't been involved with you, she would have been involved with someone else. No hard feelings. You emptied my bank accounts, stole my car, and thrashed my condo, Trey said, accusing Rick. He was angry. Rick was even in his room, had done all these things, and then had the nerve to say that there were no hard feelings. I don't know what you were talking about, Rick replied, glancing over at the nurse that was still reading the magazine. But you seriously didn't deserve the beating you got from those guys? Yeah, whatever. Trey said. He just wanted Rick to leave now. Do you believe in karma? I do. Rick paused to study Trey's face. If you hurt another person, shower them with expensive gifts, and take them on trips when their partner is away, bad things are bound to happen to you. That's how karma works. I think it's important for you to reflect on your actions and decide what kind of person you want to be. Trey looked at Rick's eyes for a moment before his guilt overcame his ego, and he looked away. I hope you get better soon, Rick said as he left the room. The nurse held up her magazine to cover her face, trying not to burst out laughing. She turned off the recording app on her phone, which she had started when she saw Rick enter the room. Soon, Rick's scolding of Dr. Cardosa would become legendary in the hospital. Rick and Deidre hurried down the last street towards the house. They had just returned from visiting the African embassies and wanted to get back in shape after enjoying a life of leisure for the past month and a half. Rick and Deidre noticed Marcy's Mercedes parked in the driveway at the same time. Holding hands, they cautiously approached the house. Marcy was sitting on the porch swing. Hello, Marcy, Rick said. Oh, Rick, can we talk? Marcy asked, standing up. Sure, Marcy, Rick replied. Alone, Marcy requested. No, I'm in a relationship with Deidre now, and she has a right to hear anything we have to say to each other, Rick answered. Marcy wasn't pleased with this at all. It had been 2 months since she last spoke to Rick, and she still held on to a glimmer of hope that she could win him back. Her therapist had told her that this hope was unrealistic, especially considering all the pain she had caused Rick over the years. Marcy tried to manipulate the narrative with her therapist, but kept making mistakes. For instance, she once complained to him about losing the jewelry Trey had given her, which led to a discussion about her secret bank accounts and the significance of the jewelry to her self-image. Marcy's therapist despised dealing with her, but knew it could lead to well-received academic papers in the future, if not a best-selling novel. The therapist had been considering reaching out to Rick Weston to get a complete picture of Marcy's behavior. Let's go inside, Deidre suggested. Marcy was surprised to see that her former home had been completely redecorated. There was no trace of her ever having lived there. She assumed that all the pictures and mementos of her life with Rick were in her storage unit. She still hadn't gone through all the boxes. I'll make some coffee, Deidre offered. Do you want anything? Marcy, coffee is fine, Marcy replied. Deidre left the living room, leaving Marcy alone with Rick. Rick, I still love you, Marcy whispered. I don't care, Rick replied flatly. Rick, I love you and I know you still love me, Marcy persisted. Marcy, You showed me love by betraying me multiple times. You demanded that I allow you to have affairs, even when I confronted you about it. If this is how you show love, then I'd rather you hate me." Rick countered. Deidre returned and sat next to Rick, who offered his hand for her to hold. "We had 24 good years together," Rick Marcy said, trying a different approach. "Don't throw that away wrong," Marcy Rick interrupted. "We had maybe 16 good years before you started cheating on me and putting your own desires above ours. You became selfish and thought you deserved more. You sacrificed our children's mental well-being by involving them in your affair while I was away. They were the ones who gathered all the evidence. They witnessed you and Dr. Morris having intimate moments at the Red Roof Inn and took pictures. They were only 11 and 13, Marcy. What kind of mother does that? I know you haven't spoken to them since you returned, but you know what they said when I told them I was divorcing you? They were relieved. They thought it was about time I divorced you." Rick paused and took a sip of coffee. Deidre picked up a small device that resembled an old cell phone from the coffee table and inspected it. "She doesn't have any hidden devices," Deidre commented. She meant that Marcy had not recorded or listened in on their conversation. What? Marcy asked, her mind struggling to make sense of Rick's words, along with Deidre's comment. Rick now knew he could speak freely without fear of legal consequences. "Kyle also informed me about your secret bank accounts and how you were hiding money from me. How is that love, Marcy? I also sold the jewelry Trey gave you. You accepted expensive gifts from your boyfriend worth tens of thousands of dollars. How is that love, right? Marcy, you went to fancy dinners and spent nights at his place while I was on business trips. How is that love? Marcy, you made me sacrifice my Army career because you claimed to be afraid of my job and then forced me to retire when you were in the middle of your affair. Now I realize you were just jealous of my success and wanted to sabotage it so you could feel special." Rick paused again to take another sip of coffee, looking affectionately at Deidre. "I want to thank you for finally revealing your true colors. It allowed me to break free from you and reconnect with Deidre. She respects me and truly loves me. She would never hide money from me or cheat on me. If we had children, she would never put them through what you did. And she would support my career instead of belittling it, because she would be proud to stand beside me through all the challenges that come with achieving our shared goals. Just like I was proud of you, until I discovered that your goals were not our goals, but your own selfish desires," Rick said. He had been holding Deidre's hand throughout the conversation and glanced at her several times as he spoke about her. "I loved you, Marcy. I made many sacrifices for you, but you were either too selfish or too blind to see it. You thought I would keep sacrificing for you, but there's a limit to how much someone can take. Even the court recognized this and granted me an immediate divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. They compared your level of abuse to that of a victim of domestic violence. I heard that you're in therapy, but I don't think you truly understand the damage you caused to our marriage. So for you to sit here and say you love me, all I can do is laugh at how ridiculous you sound. The court equated your love to that of someone who beats their spouse. What kind of love is that, Marcy?" Rick finished speaking and stared at her. Marcy sat quietly in her chair for several moments, gazing at Rick and Deidre. To Rick and Deidre, it seemed like she was in a state of shock. After a few more moments, she stood, thanked them for the coffee, and left without saying another word. A week later, Rick heard from Kyle and Rhonda that they had received an email from their mother. She had found a job on the coast and was moving away. This was the last Rick heard of Marcy. Just as the original psychological profile Rick and Deidre had made about Marcy predicted, she couldn't accept the reality of her actions and was left with no choice but to leave everything that reminded her of her wrongdoings. Classic narcissism. Josh divorced Penny, who continued working at the hospital and became the lead surgical nurse. Josh and Jenny eventually got married, and Josh became a wonderful stepfather to Jenny's children. Dr. Trey Cardosa never fully recovered from his injuries but ended up teaching at the State Medical University. However, a scandal involving a female student led to his termination and permanent revocation of his medical license. Rick and Deidre never got married. They didn't feel the need to because their love for each other was so strong that marriage was irrelevant.